So I don't know about you guys, but Deadpool got here pretty quick. At least that's how it feels to me. And for whatever reason, I was thinking in my mind like, okay, we got another month or so, but no, it's here like now. And it's crazy because that's just the world we live in with these movies now. Infinity War came out, destroyed the box office. And it still blows my mind because if you were to tell me when I was 12 years old that this movie would have been out in 2018, being the conclusion of 19 movies, and then on top of that, oh yeah, Deadpool's sequel comes out a few weeks later with Domino and Cable and Shatterstar, I probably would have looked in your face and just said, liar, liar, pants on fire. Because in that point, I would have probably been like in the 6th grade or something like that. But I was thinking, a while back I did a number of talks about Black Panther, and in those videos I mentioned a number of things about Wakanda. We dove deep into the techno-organic jungle, and I even made mention of a particular time when Cable crash landed in Wakanda, which was one of our best looks at the techno-organic jungle as far as scale, just looking at the subterranean portion. And it was in this issue of Cable that not only did we get a broad scope of Wakanda's subterranean, but we were shown where they break down and study vibranium. We were shown the train system, which is how the different miners and the different scientists get back and forth between the different sections under Wakanda. And in my opinion, a lot of these things were just a huge payoff when we finally got to see Black Panther on the big screen. And we know that Ryan Coogler pulled a number of sources from the comics for inspiration for the film, but I just can't help but to think that this particular issue of Cable was a huge influence for the subterranean portion. And all the scenes we've seen for Shuri's lab, so on and so forth. But to better explain how Cable actually got here, I want to step back to an earlier issue where Cable was trying to stop the Hellfire Club from stealing technology from one of Apocalypse's older ships. And Donald Pierce, who was with the Hellfire Club, got his hand broken again. But with Cable mainly being in pursuit of Sebastian Shaw, who had left Pierce in his escape, and he could have gotten Pierce out of there, but he just didn't. But with Cable going back to the ship which was taken off, trapped inside of the ship was Javert, who was a priest from the 39th century that Cable needed to get some answers from. But although Cable wasn't able to get him out, he was able to speak to him briefly through telepathy just before the ship exploded, sending all kind of pieces and debris back down to Earth. And this is how Cable ended up in Wakanda. And at this particular time in the comics, there wasn't like a particular force field to just keep everything out, but instead your techno-organic jungle had two portions, both your terrain and your subterranean. And on your terrain you had more of a jungle which people would get lost in. It was more like a maze with a number of traps and things to get people confused or lost from entering in Wakanda. And I have another video where I talk more about it into depth, and I'll leave a link for that for you guys to check out, because the way they describe it in the MCU and the way that it actually is in the comics, it's a bit different, because in the MCU I believe it's more of a holographic rainforest, and they generate these harsh conditions so people don't go wandering up into these mountains that ain't really there and just inadvertently stumble across Wakanda. But either way, when Cable crash lands here in Wakanda, at first he's still having flashbacks of the last thing he's seen. And when he's brought in by Wakabi and the different scouts to get medical attention, he gets looked after by T'Challa's cousin, Dr. Joshua Itobu. And what's really interesting is when Cable gets here, T'Challa recognizes him, but before he can place his finger on where he recognizes him from, the memory evaporates, which is totally a time travel thing, which Cable happens to brush off in this moment. But it was just funny to me, like when I read this again, like in 2018, where T'Challa is like, yes, I'm monarch of Wakanda, I'm the Black Panther, I just came back from helping out some of my friends, the Avengers. And T'Challa's like, yeah, you may have heard of them. And Cable's just like, have I? And it's just funny reading this now, because with us having the Black Panther movie, with us having Avengers Infinity War, because of that, Cable's response just has so much more gravity to it, because it's like, who doesn't know about the Avengers? And that statement is just so much realer today than it was back in 1993. It's insane. And going back to these older issues just makes me feel like a kid again, just realizing what reality has become today. It's pretty insane. But with T'Challa getting more familiar with Cable, inviting him to dinner in his home so he can talk about more pressing issues like how he got there. But at this point in time for T'Challa, as leader of Wakanda, he's been gradually opening up Wakanda to the rest of the world, very gradually. And in this conversation, we also get our first look at Dr. Itobu, his different perspective or view on Wakanda, and T'Challa gradually opening up. And if you guys recall the differences between N'Jobu and T'Chaka, when N'Jobu, Killmonger's father, help Klaw steal vibranium from Wakanda, but with the intention of helping his own people. We see a very similar narrative with T'Challa's cousin in the comics, Dr. Joshua Itobu, because at dinner when he went off on T'Challa, telling him how, you know, dressing up like the Black Panther, being this quote superhero, you're doing things the American way. But in Dr. Joshua's eyes, who's really a blend of both the N'Jobu and N'Jadaka that we saw in Black Panther, because with Killmonger in the film, he didn't only just want to help his own people, but he also wanted to rule. And that's more Dr. Dr. Joshua's plan for execution, but the relationship between him and T'Challa, the back and forth was much more like Njobu and T'Chaka in the film, if that makes any sense, because I feel like it's a mixture of the two that describe this relationship best, and it may have been where the writers got the idea for Killmonger and his father. Let me know what you guys think about that down in the comments. But what we eventually find out is that Dr. Joshua actually smuggled Klaw into Wakanda, and part of his plans to overthrow T'Challa so Joshua could lead the way that he saw fit, and using Klaw to see this through, but Klaw had his own secret agenda to himself. But even from the discussion earlier at the dinner table, with T'Challa mentioning opening to the world gradually, and Joshua telling T'Challa that he's becoming more Americanized, T'Challa corrected him like, this is not a superhero suit, this is my ceremonial garb. And Cable understood that, and he told him that there's gonna come a time where none of this really matters, and some of the only things that will last are your beliefs and your traditions. But it was also during this time where Cable took a walk through the woods of solitude, and during this walk where he had thought to be alone, T'Challa, who had cloaked himself from Cable's telepathy, he drops in on Cable so they can further continue their conversation. But as for us, the reader, in this issue, man, like, this blew my mind. Like, when I was a kid, this blew my mind, and it was one of the things I was waiting to see the most in Black Panther, because thanks to this issue of Cable, we got like the full tour. We saw the trains, which answered the question of how they get to different points so quickly, because the area is just so vast. And this tour finally gave us a look at not just where they're mining vibranium, but it's also an industrial environment where they can study it, but also test their studies and their theories just minutes away from where they just mined it from. Just very efficient and very productive. But while taking Cable through the techno-jungle, he introduces him to Maccabi. And I'd say between Maccabi and Wakabi, like, the film took both of their intelligence from the comics and gave it to Shuri. And more so Maccabi with the M, because Shuri in the film, she pretty much took on the role that he had as the lead scientist in Wakanda. And then as far as Wakabi, who had broken down and translated Skrull language in like a matter of seconds, like, if that needed to be done in the MCU, it would all point to Shuri, which makes sense because when you're dealing with so many characters, not just for Avengers, but in a shared universe, period, you gotta find different ways to minimize your characters. And with Shuri, even though we still have Wakabi, she's more of your 3 characters in one. But as far as Cable spending this time in the techno-jungle, and his perspective really being used as the readers, getting to see the techno-organic jungle and see it in much more depth than previous Black Panther comics or even Fantastic Four. But one of the more notable things that we see here in this in-depth view is a chamber that is soundproof, and because of the properties of vibranium in reaction to sound, in here the scientists are given a much more stable environment in order to test the vibranium and discover new ways of using it. Which brings us back to Dr. Joshua, who was very adamant about T'Challa using vibranium in military resources, of which T'Challa would never oblige, but it didn't stop him from asking. But the things that happened shortly after him asking T'Challa again, it started to give us a better view of what Klaw's plan was, because when Dr. Joshua went back to Klaw, telling him that once again T'Challa refused to weaponize the vibranium, Klaw just went off, took one of the secret passageways into the techno-organic jungle, and really just took out anybody in his path. And when this happened, Cable was the first to discover that an intruder had made it into the techno-jungle. T'Challa, he found out soon after, discovering Dr. Joshua's body, with Dr. Joshua barely clinging for life, with loss of hearing after Klaw's attack. And with what little life he had in him left, he was just trying to tell T'Challa that he was trying to do what was best for Wakanda. But not too long after, T'Challa followed the trail and he caught up with Klaw, who had already been confronted by Cable, and Cable, who had already been hit with a similar blast that Dr. Joshua had been hit with, and with which Klaw intended to kill Cable with, but Cable survived it. Which reminds me of another thing about Cable, like, he also uses, aside from his telepathy, he uses his telekinesis to shield or protect himself a lot of the time, and that's actually how he survived the crash, bringing him here into Wakanda in the first place. And we see it also come in handy when he fights against Klaw. But going back to the vacuum chamber, which we mentioned earlier, this chamber is actually what they would use to stop Klaw. And the way that Cable and T'Challa use it is much like in Black Panther, with the way that T'Challa used the train against Killmonger. And the reason that this worked was because at this point in time, Klaw's entire body was a construct of sonic energy that would come from his vibranium hand. But because inside of a vacuum no sound can exist, it would disrupt his entire body because he is a construct of sound. And because of that, when Cable and Black Panther teamed up, Cable threw him in, Black Panther cut it on, and the construct of Klaw was destroyed, but not him literally, because in this case it all comes from the hand, or from the claw. But that'll do it for this one, guys. Right after that, Cable's ship was fixed and he was up out of there, and that's about it. But let me know you guys' thoughts down in the comments. Like, to me, like, I like this because it wasn't a world-ending event, because every issue doesn't have to be the end of the world, but instead it was just a cool little cameo. But let me know down in the comments who else going to see Deadpool 2, squad up, and we'll do it again on the next one. Alright, later.